The air inside the Oakhaven town hall tasted of stale tobacco, alkali dust, and the sharp, metallic tang of an impending winter storm. The draft that slipped through the warped floorboards wasn't merely a chill, it was a physical entity. A rusted blade scraping persistently against Martha's ankles, numbing the very roots of her stance. She stood at the back of the room, her hands folded rigidly over a heavy woolen apron that still smelled faintly of lye soap and damp earth, her fingers calloused and mapped with 100 tiny, faded scars from chopping kindling and tending feverish brows, picked blindly at a frayed seam. She was 38, in the hardscrabble, unforgiving logic of the frontier. 38 unmarried years meant a woman was no longer a person. She was a worn, thin fixture, like the peeling paint on the Methodist church steeple or a rusted plow left out in the freezing rain. The town saw her as a beast of burden who had somehow outlived her burden. For a decade, she had nursed a father with black lung, listening to him cough up the coal mine piece by piece, and tended to a mother whose mind had slowly unspooled into a dark, unrecognizable tangle. Now, the bitter earth had claimed them both, leaving Martha completely hollowed out. She was a dry husk standing in the periphery of a life she never got the chance to live. The exhaustion didn't just sit in her bones, it pressed against her ribs like a cold iron weight, suffocating the air before it could reach her lungs. Every breath was a conscious, labor-intensive act. She felt invisible, yet unbearably exposed, standing in the shadows as the town gossiped, devoid of the bitterness they expected from her, left only with a profound emptiness that defied language. Then, the floorboards near the far wall groaned. It was a slow, deliberate sound, heavy enough to cut through the low hum of the congregation. A shadow detached itself from the dim corner next to the unlit wood stove. It was a mountain of a man wrapped in a heavy canvas duster, carrying the scent of raw pine sap, wet leather, and something inherently dangerous. He didn't speak, but his mere presence settled over the murmuring crowd like a thick, suffocating woolen blanket. The room's air pressure shifted, the idle chatter withered, swallowed entirely by the giant's looming, silent approach. At the front of the hall, elevated on an overturned crate of dry goods to ensure every eye in Oakhaven found him, stood her younger brother, Silas. Silas had fled for the city a decade past, slipping away in the dead of night with a carpetbag and the last of their father's silver coins. He had returned only when the telegraph operator relayed the news that the old man's lungs had finally given out, confirming there was an estate left to liquidate. His tailored wool suit was entirely too clean for this room, his polished leather boots utterly unscuffed by the salt of the earth. He looked like a man who had never held a shovel, let alone buried a parent in the frozen, unyielding ground. The soil up on the ridge is dead, and frankly, the homestead itself is a rotting liability, Silas announced. His voice carried the polished, brassy ring of a city banker, a tone deliberately crafted to slice through the murmurs of the townsfolk. He didn't look at Martha. He looked through her, his gaze sweeping over the crowd as if she were nothing more than an inconvenient shadow cast by the doorway. I've spoken with the surveyor. I am selling the acreage to the mining conglomerate by the end of the week. As for the matter of my sister, he paused, allowing a calculated, theatrical sigh to fill the stagnant air. He adjusted his silk cravat, his knuckles pale and unblemished. The whispers began instantly. They crawled like venomous centipedes through the oak pews, rustling under the wide brims of worn hats and behind the gloved hands of the church-going women. Ain't got a single dime to her name. Too old to take a husband now, too stubborn to take the county's charity. Reckon the asylum over in Blackwood'll take her? Heard they got a ward for spinsters who lose their wits. Twixt you and me, she's been living like a feral dog up on that ridge anyway." Martha's jaw tightened until the hinge ached. Every syllable spoken by the crowd drove another jagged splinter of ice deep into her chest. She remembered sitting up for 3 days straight to break the Miller boy's fever when the town doctor was too drunk to ride out. She remembered kneading dough until her shoulders screamed, baking loaves for the widow Harris when the mill burned to the mud. Now, their voices stripped her bare. The betrayal didn't manifest as tears. It manifested as a profound, ringing numbness in her ears. The memory of the flour on her hands, the warmth of the hearth she had kept ablaze for everyone else, turned into ash on her tongue. The cold iron weight inside her ribs expanded, pressing against her sternum. She realized, with a blinding clarity, that virtue in Oakhaven was a currency no one recognized unless it was stamped in silver. Her decades of silent sacrifice were entirely invisible to them, overwritten by the simple, unforgivable crime of being an aging woman without a man to speak for her. Silas pulled a gold pocket watch from his vest, snapping it open with a sharp click that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. "I'm a reasonable man," he continued, his voice dripping with a sickly sweet magnanimity, "and I recognize the burden she presents to this community. Therefore, I am willing to offer $10 from the estate's sale to anyone who will take her on as a domestic." He smiled, a cruel, tight stretching of his lips. "Consider it a charity of sorts. She's strong enough for heavy scrub work. She can haul water, mend the rusted tools. She's used to the dirt." The humiliation was absolute. A heavy, suffocating shroud dropped over her shoulders. The town hall fell dead silent. No one moved. No one spoke up to defend her. The silence of the people she had bled for was louder than any insult Silas could have conjured. Men stared at the floorboards. Women refused to meet her eye. The air tasted metallic, sharp, and unforgiving. The blacksmith, a man named Miller, whose son Martha had saved, shifted his weight, his boots scraping loudly against the wood. He opened his mouth, his face flushed under a layer of soot. But his wife quickly yanked on his sleeve, pulling him back down into the pew. The sight of Miller sitting back down felt like a physical blow to the stomach. It knocked the wind out of her. She didn't blame him. She recognized the worn, thin survival instinct of a family man, calculating the cost of another mouth to feed. Yet, the cowardice of it gnawed at the edges of her sanity. She had traded her youth, her softness, and her future for these people, replacing her own dreams with the grim reality of poultices, boiling water, and death rattles. And now, at the final accounting, her ledger was empty. They were letting her drown. Silas let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Nothing? Not a single taker for $10? Well, I suppose the county poorhouse is the only recourse." I washed my hands of it. Martha stared at the wood stove, watching the way the dying embers pulsed weakly through the cast iron grate. The ash gathered at the bottom, gray and lifeless. She felt exactly like that ash. The bitterness she had fought to keep at bay for years finally breached the walls of her chest. A toxic, dark tide that tasted of rusted nails and old blood. The auction of her life had concluded with no bidders. "I'll take the land." The voice was gravel and distant thunder tearing through the suffocating silence of the hall. It didn't ask permission. It stated an immovable fact. The crowd parted, people practically scrambling over the wooden pews to get out of the way, like water hitting a jagged stone. The mountain of a man stepped fully into the lamplight, It was Elias Vance, to the town of Oakhaven. He was a ghost story breathed only in hushed tones, a former sheriff who had retreated to the high ridges years ago after the cattle wars. He was built of granite and quiet violence. His face was weathered like a cracked alkali flat, marked by a thick, pale scar that ran from his cheekbone down to his jawline, pulling the skin tight when he moved. He walked with a terrifying, deliberate economy. Every step was measured, his heavy leather boots making no hollow sounds, only deep, solid thuds against the floorboards, beside Silas's polished city frame. Elias looked like a dormant grizzly bear tolerating the frantic buzzing of a gnat. Silas swallowed hard, taking a half step back, his city-bred confidence fracturing instantly. The land is appraised at $500. Vance. Elias reached inside his heavy canvas duster. The rhythm of his breathing was infuriatingly slow, entirely unbothered by the tension he had dragged into the room. His massive, calloused hand emerged holding a worn leather pouch. He didn't toss it. He simply held his arm out and let it drop onto the crate next to Silas's polished boots. It hit the wood with a heavy, indisputable impact that made the crate groan under the weight. 600, Elias rumbled, his voice low enough to vibrate in the floorboards beneath Martha's feet. Gold. Silas stared at the pouch, his eyes darting between the fortune and the giant standing before him. He licked his lips, desperately trying to recover a scrap of his shattered pride in front of the congregation. Fine. Sold. And I suppose you want the $10 to take the spinster off my hands? A man your size needs a cook up on that ridge. Elias didn't look at Silas. He turned his massive shoulders, his gaze cutting through the dusty air and locking onto Martha in the shadows. His eyes were dark, unreadable pools, yet anchored with a gravity that made the entire room hold its collective breath. The scar on his jaw pulled taut as a muscle feathered in his cheek. Keep your blood money, boy, Elias said, the jagged sentence slicing through the stifling air. I'm not buying a servant, I'm settling a debt for a person who shouldn't have one. The words struck Martha's chest with the force of a physical blow, shattering the iron weight that had pinned her ribs together for a decade. He didn't look at her with the pity of the townspeople, nor the thinly veiled disgust of her brother. He looked at her with the solemn, unflinching recognition of a fellow survivor. The sheer shock of being seen, truly seen as a person rather than a ledger entry or a discarded burden, made the edges of her vision blur. For the first time in 10 years, she didn't feel like a dying ember. She felt a terrifying, unfamiliar spark of consequence. Elias turned his back on Silas, dismissing the boy entirely, and walked down the center aisle. The townsfolk shrank back further, the raw, dangerous energy radiating off his heavy coat, pushing them into the walls. He stopped exactly 2 feet in front of Martha. The overwhelming scent of pine sap, sharp, cold wind, and gun oil washed over her, grounding her spinning senses. Martha's chest heaved. Her hands gripped the coarse wool of her apron. She swallowed the dry tremor in her throat, her stutters giving way as her chin lifted, her spine turning to rusted steel. I ain't Charity, Elias Vance, and I won't be swept into a corner just 'cause you paid my brother's ransom. Elias looked down at her. His massive chest rose and fell once. I reckon you ain't, he replied. The words were soft, rough-hewn, yet carrying 1,000 unspoken promises. He gestured toward the door. Grab your coat. Martha, we have fences to mend. Without waiting for a reply, he turned and pushed open the heavy oak doors of the town hall, The biting winter wind howled into the room, instantly killing the flames in the wall lamps and scattering the townspeople's malicious whispers into the frozen night. Martha looked at her brother one last time, observing the pathetic, small man he had become. She adjusted her frayed shawl, stepped out of the shadows, and followed the giant into the dark, leaving Oakhaven to choke on its own silence. The buckboard wagon rattled over the rutted, frozen earth, every jolt transferring from the iron-rimmed wheels straight up into Martha's spine. Oakhaven was miles behind them now, swallowed entirely by the dense, suffocating stands of black spruce and the heavy curtain of night. The wind off the high ridge didn't just blow, it scoured. It carried a biting chill that tasted of pulverized ice and dead leaves, whipping across the open wagon seat to tear at the frayed edges of her wool shawl. She pulled the thin fabric tighter around her shoulders, the cold seeping into her marrow. A stark, physical reminder of the bridge she had just burned to ash. Elias sat beside her, a monolithic silhouette against the bruised purple canvas of the sky. He held the thick leather reins with a loose, practiced grip, his massive hands encased in worn hide gloves. He hadn't spoken a single word since they left the town hall. The silence stretching between them wasn't empty. It was dense, fraught with the unspoken weight of what had just transpired. For a decade, Martha's world had been filled with the wet, rattling coughs of her father and the nonsensical, frightened ramblings of her mother. To be plunged suddenly into this profound, bottomless quiet felt like stepping off a cliff in the pitch dark. Her mind raced, the echoes of the town's whispers still scraping against the inside of her skull like rusted nails. She looked down at her hands, the skin mapped with calluses and burns. She had traded her youth for a ledger that Silas had simply tossed into the fire. The sheer injustice of it gnawed at her, a bitter acid in the pit of her stomach. She glanced sideways at the giant next to her. Why had he done it? $600 in gold was a fortune that could buy a dozen fertile acres down in the valley. Yet he had thrown it down for a ruined homestead and a 38-year-old spinster. The uncertainty tightened her jaw. She refused to owe another man her life. She would not be a charity case dragging behind his coattails. The horses, two massive roans with breath pluming from their nostrils like steam from a locomotive, navigated the treacherous, ice-slicked incline with steady rhythm. Elias's physical movements were a study in extreme control. Every so often, he would adjust his posture, the heavy canvas of his duster shifting with a rough scrape against the wooden bench. His jaw remained locked, the jagged scar pulling taut. When a lone timber wolf howled somewhere deep in the timberline, a sound that made Martha's breath hitch. Elias merely turned his head a fraction of an inch. His hand didn't drop to the Winchester rifle resting near his boots. He simply acknowledged the threat and dismissed it in the same heartbeat. The rhythm of his breathing never changed, slow, deep, like a bellows feeding a low, steady forge. The temperature plummeted as they climbed higher onto the ridge. Frost began to form on the coarse hairs of the horses' coats, and the skeletal branches of the birch trees flanking the trail looked like bone-white fingers reaching down, attempting to drag them back to the valley. The isolation of the frontier pressed in on all sides. Down in Oakhaven, the cruelty had been loud and communal. Up here, the cruelty was elemental. The mountain didn't care about reputations or debts. It only cared about who had the grit to survive the freeze. After what felt like an eternity of bone-rattling progress, the tree line broke, revealing a jagged clearing illuminated by the harsh silver light of a full moon. Martha's homestead, her family's legacy, sat at the center, though homestead was a generous term. The roof of the main cabin sagged under a heavy blanket of snow, the cedar shakes rotting and curled like dead leaves. The porch steps were splintered, the corral fence leaning drunkenly to one side, its rails gray and weather-beaten. It was a monument to failure, a rotting corpse of a dream her father had stubbornly clung to until his lungs gave out. Elias pulled back on the reins, uttering a low, guttural, "Whoa." The wagon rolled to a halt, the sudden cessation of movement making the profound silence of the ridge deafening. He secured the brake, the iron lever protesting with a sharp squeal. Stepping down from the wagon, the ground crunched heavily under his boots. He didn't offer his hand to help her down. It wasn't rudeness. It was an innate understanding that a woman who had survived what she had didn't need to be coddled. Martha climbed down, her knees stiff and trembling from the cold. Her boots hit the frozen mud. She stood before the ruined cabin, the wind whipping her skirts around her ankles, the smell of decay, wet wood, dormant earth, and abandonment was overpowering. "It's worse than I reckon I remembered," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Her voice sounded brittle, thin against the vastness of the mountain. Elias walked to the back of the wagon, lifting a heavy wooden crate of supplies as if it weighed no more than a sack of flour. He carried it up the groaning steps and kicked the front door open. The hinges screamed in protest, a long, agonizing wail that echoed into the timber. "Wood's still thick," he replied, his voice a low rumble from the doorway. He set the crate down on the dusty floorboards. "Bones are good. The rest is just sweat." He turned back, his imposing frame filling the doorway. The moonlight caught the pale line of his scar. "Ain't much for talking, Martha. Never was. Town folks use their words to strip you to the bone. Up here, we use our hands to build it back. You want to stand in the cold and mourn the rot. That's your right. But I'm lighting a fire." He disappeared into the pitch-black interior. The bluntness of his words struck her, not with cruelty, but with a jarring, bracing clarity. It was the absolute absence of pity. He didn't care about the gossip. He didn't care about Silas. He only cared about the structure, the survival, the work. The iron weight in her chest shifted, the suffocating pressure easing just a fraction of an inch. She looked back at the tree line, down toward the valley where the town lay blind and warm. Then she looked at the open door, where the faint, rhythmic strike of flint against steel began to ring out from the dark. Martha picked up her small canvas bag. She squared her shoulders against the biting wind, stepping up the rotting stairs, and walked into the dark to help him build the fire. The dawn did not break over the ridge. It bled through the skeletal pines, a bruised, gunmetal gray that offered light but absolutely no warmth. The inside of the cabin was bitter, the fire in the hearth having burned down to a fragile bed of white ash. Martha woke with a stiffness in her joints that felt like ground glass. She didn't linger under the thin woolen blanket. The luxury of hesitation belonged to the valley. Up here, stillness was a precursor to freezing. She dressed in the near dark, wrapping herself in 3 layers of worn linen and the heavy, soil-stained apron. When she stepped out onto the porch, the air hit her lungs like a swallowed blade. The homestead looked even more desolate in the harsh morning light. The corral fence was a broken jaw of rotted cedar posts and sagging rails, groaning under the weight of the night's frost. Elias was already awake. He was out by the dilapidated barn, a massive shadow moving with terrifying efficiency. He had a 2-man crosscut saw, though he was using it alone, the thick steel blade singing a rhythmic, metallic song as it bit deep into a felled spruce. He didn't greet her. The rhythm of his broad shoulders didn't break. He simply let the work speak for the morning. Martha walked to the collapsed tool shed. The hinges were frozen solid, requiring a brutal kick to shatter the ice sealing them shut. Inside, the smell of neglect was thick, mildewed leather, mouse droppings, and the sharp, coppery scent of rusted iron. She sifted through a tangle of frayed ropes and oxidized drill bits until she found her father's old tool chest. At the bottom, wrapped in an oilcloth, lay a heavy, forged steel claw hammer. The hickory handle was dark, polished smooth by decades of her father's sweat. She picked it up. It was heavy, head-weighted, demanding respect. For the first time in her life, the weight of a tool didn't feel like an anchor. It felt like a weapon. She carried the hammer and a canvas sack of reclaimed, crooked nails to the far end of the corral. The wind off the alkali flats below howled, tearing at her hair, but she focused entirely on the rotten wood before her. She wedged the rusted claw of the hammer beneath the head of a bent square nail, securing a splintered rail. The iron was fused to the wood by years of harsh weather. She planted her boots into the frozen mud, wrapped her raw, bare hands around the hickory handle, and pulled. Her shoulders screamed, the muscles in her back, accustomed to the slow, heavy lifting of bedridden bodies, violently protested the sharp, explosive exertion. The nail didn't budge. She adjusted her grip, feeling the rough grain of the wood bite into her calluses. She took a breath that tasted of pine needles and frost, grounded her heels, and threw her entire body weight backward. The wood cracked. The rusted iron let out a sharp, agonizing screech, surrendering its grip. The nail tore free, sending a shower of dry, powdery rot into the air. Martha stumbled back, catching her balance. She looked at the twisted piece of iron in the hammer's claw. It wasn't just a nail. It was the memory of Widow Harris complaining about the crust on the bread. It was the blacksmith's wife pulling her husband back down into the pew. It was the sound of Silas auctioning her off for $10. She tossed the rusted nail into the snow. She stepped up to the next one, wedged the claw, and pulled again. Screech, crack, thud. By midday, her hands were a map of fresh disasters. Blisters had formed, burst, and bled. The raw skin mixing with the dirt and rust to create a dark, painful paste across her palms. The sour smell of her own sweat permeated the heavy wool of her coat, a sharp contrast to the biting mountain air. Yet, a strange, terrifying heat was building in her chest. She hoisted a fresh rail, a heavy, unyielding slab of raw pine Elias had split, and rested it against the upright post. Her left arm trembled violently under the weight. She didn't have the brute strength of the giant across the yard, so she had to use leverage. She wedged her knee under the wood, bracing it against her hip, ignoring the dull throb of a bruise blooming across her thigh. With her right hand, she set a straightened nail against the joint. She swung the hammer. The first strike was a glancing blow. The heavy steel head slipped off the nail, crashing brutally onto her thumb. The pain was blinding, a white-hot flare that shot straight up her arm and lodged behind her eyes. She dropped the hammer. She didn't scream. She clamped her good hand over the injured thumb, dropping to her knees in the freezing mud. The silence of the ridge pressed down on her, waiting for the inevitable surrender. The mountain expected her to weep. The town of Oakhaven expected her to break. Across the yard, the singing of the crosscut saw stopped. Elias stood up. He watched her from 50 yards away. His posture was perfectly still. He didn't drop his tools. He didn't rush over to offer a torn rag or a sympathetic word. He simply watched her, his dark eyes unreadable, the thick scar on his jaw pulling tight. He was giving her the space to either shatter or harden. Martha stared at the mud. The throbbing in her hand matched the chaotic beating of her heart. She closed her eyes, letting the bitter wind cool the sweat on her forehead. The iron weight that used to sit in her chest, the suffocating expectation of failure, was gone. In its place was a sharp, jagged piece of flint. She opened her eyes, spat a mouthful of metallic-tasting saliva into the dirt, and picked up the hammer with her left hand. She rose to her feet. She wedged her knee back under the heavy pine rail, adjusting her grip until the throbbing in her right thumb faded into a dull, manageable roar behind her eardrums. She lined up the nail. She swung. The strike was true, the heavy thwack of steel against iron ringing out like a church bell across the hollow. She swung again. Thwack! Again! Thwack! The nail sank deep, its head flush with the raw wood, binding the joint with an unbreakable permanence. Martha stepped back, her chest heaving, her breath pluming in the freezing air. She looked at the secured rail. It wasn't pretty. It was hard scrabble, desperate work, but it held. It was hers. Across the yard, Elias slowly nodded his massive head once. Then he bent back down, and the metallic singing of the saw resumed, joining the steady, unyielding rhythm of her hammer. The battle outside against the rotting timber was won with iron and sweat, but the war inside the kitchen was waged with fire and lard. The hearth of the cabin was a cavernous, soot-stained throat of stone that had remained cold for too long. Martha spent the late afternoon of the third day on her knees, scraping layers of calcified grease and ancient ash from the iron grate until her knuckles bled and the smell of lye soap seemed to permeate her very pores. The kitchen didn't just need cleaning. It needed to be reclaimed from the ghost of her mother's despair. She started with the flour. It was a heavy, stone-ground sack Elias had brought from the valley, smelling of sun-baked earth and distant summers. Martha dumped a mountain of it onto the scrubbed pine table, the white dust rising in a fine cloud that caught the dying amber light of the window. She added a pinch of coarse salt and a dollop of rendered lard, the white fat cold and stubborn between her fingers. Then came the kneading. Martha threw the weight of her entire body into the dough. She pushed with the heels of her hands, the muscles in her forearms, already screaming from the morning's carpentry, knotting into hard, painful chords. She folded the heavy mass over, pushed and turned, fold, push, turn. The rhythm was hypnotic, a physical prayer. The dough was unyielding at first, a cold and shaggy mess. But as the heat from her palms began to work, it transformed. It became elastic, alive. A smooth and warm entity that resisted her just enough to make the victory meaningful. Internal echo. With every rhythmic press, a memory surfaced, triggered by the earthy scent of the rising yeast. She heard her mother's voice, not the shrill, frightened bird chirp of her final years, but the steeled, quiet command of the woman who had once held this ridge against the winter. The bread knows when you're afraid. Martha, don't let it master you. You master the grain. Martha's eyes burned, not with tears, but with the raw friction of the past. She realized then that Silas hadn't just sold the land, he had tried to sell the very marrow of these memories. Every shove of her hands into the dough was a strike against him, a way to anchor herself to the soil he had deemed worthless. She stoked the fire until the cast iron stove began to tick and groan, the metal expanding under the intense heat. She greased the heavy pans with a rhythmic flick of a rag, the lard sizzling as it hit the hot surface. When she slid the loaves into the dark maw of the oven, the silence of the cabin began to change. It was no longer the silence of abandonment. It was the expectant hush of a home being fed. Soon, the aroma began to drift. It was a thick, golden scent, the smell of toasted crust, caramelized yeast, and the sharp, spicy undertone of the cinnamon Elias had produced from a hidden pocket of his duster. It was a smell that didn't just sit in the air, it climbed into the lungs, warming the body from the inside out. It was a defiance against the alkali dust and the metallic sting of failure. Elias entered the cabin as the sun dipped below the jagged spine of the mountain. He stopped just inside the door, the heavy canvas of his coat dripping with melted frost. He didn't say a word, but the way his nostrils flared as he took in the scent of the bread told her more than a poem ever could. He moved to the corner, unbuckling his heavy gun belt and resting his Winchester against the stone hearth with a slow, reverent care. They ate in the amber glow of a single tallow candle. The stew Martha had simmered, a dark, rich concoction of dried beef, shriveled potatoes, and wild onions, was thick enough to stand a spoon in. But it was the bread that anchored the meal. Elias broke a loaf with his massive, scarred hands, the crust crackling like dry autumn leaves. He took a bite, his eyes closing for a fraction of a second, the jagged scar on his jaw softening in the dim light. The silence between them began to shift. The friction of the first few days, the sharp edges of two strangers forced into a hard Scrabble alliance, began to wear thin. After the meal, the fire in the hearth was the only thing standing between them and the predatory cold of the high ridge. Martha sat on a low stool, her hands resting in her lap, the skin of her palms so raw they felt like they were pulsing in time with the fire. Elias sat in the heavy oak chair he had spent the afternoon mending, his massive frame casting a shadow that stretched up to the rafters. He reached into a small tin on the mantel and pulled out a jar of thick, yellow salve. He didn't ask. He simply gestured for her hand. Martha hesitated, the old instinct to hide her weakness flaring up. But the look in Elias's eyes wasn't pity. It was a quiet, steeled recognition of the cost of mastery. She reached out, her small, battered hand disappearing into his. His touch was unexpectedly light. He didn't fumble. His massive fingers, calloused from years of gripping roans and triggers, moved with the precision of a watchmaker as he rubbed the cool, medicinal grease into her burst blisters. The scent of pine resin and beeswax filled the small space between them. "My father had hands like these," Elias said softly, his voice a low vibration that seemed to come from the floorboards. It was the longest sentence he had spoken in days. Used to say a man who didn't have scars on his palms was a man who let others do his living for him. Martha looked at the fire, the orange light dancing in the dark depths of the hearth. "I spent 10 years tending to the dying. Elias, I thought my scars were all on the inside. I didn't reckon I had any room left for the outside ones." Elias didn't look up from her hand. He worked the salve into the crease of her thumb, the one she had struck with the hammer. "The inside ones just weigh you down. These ones..." He tapped her palm gently. "These ones tell you that you're still standing. The ridge don't care about your heart. Martha, it only cares if you can hold the bit." He released her hand. The sudden absence of his warmth felt like a physical chill. He leaned back, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames, his face a mask of somber reflection. "I lost a wife and a daughter to the fever back in '72, he said, the words jagged and sharp, as if they were being dragged over broken glass. The town, they offered me their prayers and their black veils, but none of them offered to help me dig the graves in the frozen ground. I learned then that people use words to hide from the truth of the world. The world is bone and stone and winter. Everything else is just talk." Diurnal echo. Martha watched the way his scars pulled when he spoke of his loss. She realized that his silence wasn't a wall designed to keep her out. It was a sanctuary he had built to keep the world from hurting him again. They were both outcasts, hollowed out by different tragedies, yet standing on the same ground. She felt a sudden, terrifying surge of vulnerability, a softening of the steeled declaration she had made to herself. She wasn't just a domestic, and he wasn't just a buyer. They were two rusted pieces of iron being hammered together on the mountain's anvil. "Would you have stayed?" Martha asked, her voice a mere whisper against the crackle of the logs. "If Silas hadn't auctioned me off, if I was just there in the silence." Elias turned his head, his dark eyes meeting hers. For a moment, the hero's mask slipped, and she saw the profound, heroic weariness underneath. "I reckon I would have found a reason to come up this ridge anyway," he replied. He stood up, the movement slow and rhythmic. He took a heavy woolen blanket from the chest and laid it over her shoulders. His hand lingered for a second on her arm, a touch that was both a shield and a promise. "Get some sleep, Martha. The blizzard is coming. I can taste the alkali in the wind." He walked to the door, checking the heavy iron bolt one last time, before retreating to his bedroll near the hearth. Martha wrapped the blanket tight, the smell of the bread still lingering in the rafters, and for the first time in a decade, the silence didn't feel like a weight. It felt like a foundation. The blizzard did not announce itself with a howl. It arrived as a solid, suffocating wall of white that erased the world beyond the porch steps. Inside the cabin, the temperature plummeted so rapidly that frost patterns began to form on the inside of the window glass. The jagged ice crystals crept across the panes, resembling the skeletal fingers of the past, desperately trying to claw their way back in, threatening to drag Martha back into the frozen paralysis of Oakhaven. But the fire in the hearth roared, fueled by the split pine, holding the ghosts at bay. The heavy oak door burst open, shattering the quiet. The wind screamed into the room, bringing with it a flurry of snow and the sharp, coppery scent of fresh blood. Elias stood in the frame, his duster plastered to his massive frame by the wet snow. He wasn't holding his rifle. His hands were stained a dark, glossy crimson. "The roan!" He grunted, fighting the door shut against the gale. His chest heaved, the air rattling in his lungs. Kicked through a rotted slat in the stall. Wood splintered deep into the foreleg. He's bleeding out. The panic in the room was a tangible thing, a heavy iron bell ringing in the confined space. In the town, this was the moment a woman was expected to weep, to wring her hands and wait for a man to find the solution. Martha didn't wring her hands. The decade she had spent in the suffocating grip of sickness and decay had forged a terrifying clinical calm inside her. The iron weight in her ribs didn't crush her, it anchored her. "Fetch the heavy gut thread from the saddlebag," Martha ordered, her voice completely devoid of a stutter, ringing out with a steeled, authoritative clarity that made Elias blink. "And the turpentine. I need boiling water. Now." They moved through the blinding white of the storm to the barn. leaning into the wind like two draft animals in the same yoke. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wet winter coat, manure, and panic. The massive roan was thrashing in the narrow stall, its eyes rolling white with terror. A jagged, pulsing gash ran down its right foreleg, the blood pooling rapidly in the sawdust. Elias threw his massive weight against the horse's neck, his thick arms wrapping around the animal, pinning it against the stall wall. The veins in his neck bulged as he fought the sheer, wild power of a 1,000-pound beast fighting for its life. "Hold him," Martha commanded. She dropped to her knees in the blood-soaked sawdust, utterly ignoring the freezing dampness seeping through her wool skirt. She worked with a brutal, mesmerizing efficiency. She washed the wound first, pouring the hot water and raw turpentine directly over the torn flesh. The horse let out an agonizing, high-pitched scream, bucking violently. Elias's boots slid in the mud, his scar pulling taut as he absorbed the blow, but he held fast, becoming an immovable pillar of stone. Martha didn't flinch, her hands, mapped with fresh blisters and old burns from the hearth, plunged into the wound. She used her bare fingers to probe the torn muscle, feeling for splinters of cedar. The slick, hot blood coated her skin, running down her wrists. She found a jagged shard of wood buried deep near the tendon. With a sharp, practiced twist, she yanked it free. Then came the needle. It was a heavy, curved piece of steel designed for mending saddles, not flesh. She threaded the thick gut line, her hands perfectly steady. She pinched the edges of the horse's torn hide together. The physical sensation of pushing the blunt steel through the tough, unyielding equine skin required immense force. She pushed the heel of her palm against the needle, burying it, then pulling the heavy thread through with a wet, sickening snap. With every stitch, the memory of sewing her father's burial suit threatened to surface, the suffocating smell of camphor, the silence of the dead room. But she pushed it down. This was not a shroud, this was a reclamation. She was knitting life back together in a place that only knew how to take it apart. The rhythm took over, pierce, pull, tie off, pierce, pull, tie off. The metallic tang of the blood filled her nose, but her focus narrowed entirely to the mechanics of survival. Her raw, blistered fingers worked the heavy thread until the horrific gash was closed, sealed under a thick poultice of dried comfrey and yarrow she had ground in a mortar just hours before. She tied the final knot and slumped back onto her heels. Her breathing was ragged, her arms felt like lead. Elias slowly released his grip on the exhausted animal. The roan stood trembling, favoring the leg, but the bleeding had stopped. Elias looked down at the mud, at the blood-soaked sawdust, and finally, at the woman kneeling in the center of it. He reached down, his massive, blood-stained hand offering her an anchor. Martha looked at his hand, then up at his face. The stoic, untouchable hero of the high ridge wasn't looking at her as a spinster, a charity case, or a debt. He was looking at an equal. She placed her hand in his, and he pulled her to her feet with a gentleness that entirely contradicted his violent strength. They walked back to the cabin in the heart of the blizzard. Once inside, the fire cast long, dancing shadows against the log walls. Martha stood by the wash basin, scrubbing the dried blood from her hands and forearms with harsh lye soap. The water turned a murky, rusted red. Elias sat by the hearth. He watched the way her shoulders moved, the sheer, undeniable capability of her presence. He picked up the heavy iron coffee pot from the coals and poured a steaming measure into a tin cup. He walked over to the wash basin and set the cup on the scarred wooden table beside her. He didn't offer a grand speech of gratitude. In the frontier lexicon, words were cheap. Actions were the currency of the soul. "Town said you were hollowed out," Elias murmured, his voice a low vibration beneath the howling wind outside. Town was comprised of fools. Martha dried her hands on a coarse towel. She picked up the tin cup, the heat of the metal seeping into her aching joints. She looked at him over the rim, the bitter, dark brew tasting of chicory and survival. The silence in the room no longer pressed against her ribs. It wrapped around them both, a shared fortress against the storm. The bitter creak of her past had finally frozen over, and she realized, with a quiet, steeled conviction, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. She wasn't just surviving the ridge, she was mastering it. The winter finally broke, not with a sudden, forgiving warmth, but with a slow, agonizing surrender of the ice. The heavy snowpack that had isolated the ridge began to bleed into the dark, alkaline soil, turning the homestead yard into a treacherous mire of cold, gray mud. The air lost its razor edge, replaced by the damp, heavy scent of thawing earth, rotting pine needles, and the raw, unpolished promise of survival. Inside the cabin, the iron weight that had occupied Martha's chest for a decade was entirely gone. It had been replaced by the steady, rhythmic pulse of a life earned through blistered hands and relentless labor. The corral was rebuilt, the thick cedar rails standing defiant against the valley winds. The roan had healed, its thick, jagged scar a perfect mirror to the ones worn by the man who had bought the land. Martha stood on the porch, a heavy woven shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, watching the meltwater drip from the eaves. The rhythmic plop, plop of the water hitting the mud was a steady metronome to the quiet peace she had forged. She held a tin cup of dark chicory coffee, the steam rising to warm her wind-chapped face. She was no longer the hollowed-out spinster of Oakhaven. She was the steward of this ridge. Then the profound peace was shattered. It started as a low, wet rhythm in the distance, the heavy, sucking sound of hooves tearing through the spring mud. The sound didn't belong to a lone rider passing through. It was a chaotic, aggressive cadence. Martha lowered her cup, the hot metal suddenly feeling like ice in her palms. From the dense timberline emerged 4 riders. They didn't ride with the respectful and cautious gait of travelers seeking shelter. They rode with the reckless arrogance of conquerors. At the lead was Silas. His tailored wool suit was now splattered to the knees with the foul, gray muck of the trail, his silk cravat loosened and stained with nervous sweat. The veneer of the polished city banker had worn dangerously thin, revealing the desperate, spiteful boy beneath. Behind him rode 3 men who looked like they had been scraped from the bottom of a Rust Belt saloon. They wore heavy, grease-stained canvas and leather, their faces hidden beneath the wide, low brims of slouch hats. They carried themselves with the loose, predatory slouch of men who sold violence by the hour. Heavy Henry rifles rested casually across their saddle horns. Martha's jaw tightened until her teeth ached. The sight of her brother didn't evoke fear. It evoked a profound, violently rising tide of revulsion. The memory of the town hall, of being publicly auctioned for $10, tasted like rusted iron on the back of her tongue. But this time, she didn't shrink into the shadows of the doorway. She stood her ground on the warped porch boards, her posture rigid, her calloused hands gripping the tin cup until her knuckles turned a stark bone white. Elias stepped out from the darkness of the barn. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He moved with that same terrifying, deliberate economy, his heavy leather boots sinking into the mud with deep, indisputable thuds. He carried a heavy timber axe in his right hand, the broad steel blade gleaming dull and lethal in the overcast light. He stopped precisely midway between the cabin and the riders, placing himself as a physical monolith blocking the path to the porch. Silas pulled his horse up hard, the animal tossing its head and snorting in protest. The 3 hired guns fanned out behind him, their horses sidestepping nervously in the muck, the largest of the thugs, a man with a ruined nose and a missing ear, lazily clicked the hammer of his rifle back. The metallic snick echoed off the cabin walls, sharp and purposeful. Elias didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the man with the rifle. His dark, unreadable eyes remained fixed entirely on Silas. The jagged scar on his jaw pulled tight, a pale lightning bolt against his weathered skin. His breathing was infuriatingly slow, the rhythmic rise and fall of a massive bellows preparing for the forge. "You're a long way from the bank, boy," Elias rumbled. His voice was gravel and low thunder, scraping across the muddy yard. Silas sneered, though his hand trembled slightly against the leather reins. He reached inside his ruined coat and pulled out a folded piece of heavy parchment. "The deed you bought is void. Vance, I've been to the county seat. The gold you paid with? The assayer claims it came from a federal transport hit 3 years ago. It's impounded as stolen property." Martha felt the cold seep through her boots. The accusation hung in the damp air, a toxic smoke designed to suffocate them both. She knew it was a lie, a desperate, fabricated legal threat spun by a man who couldn't stand the idea of his discarded sister finding worth in the dirt he had abandoned. Silas didn't care about the law. He cared about the humiliation of being bested in front of Oakhaven. He had brought these men to take the land back by force, using the forged parchment as a flimsy excuse to bury them both on the ridge. The transfer was legally witnessed by the town. Martha spoke, her voice ringing out clear and steeled, slicing through the heavy, wet air. She didn't stutter. The words were a forged blade. "You took the payment, Silas. The land belongs to us." Silas's eyes darted to her, his sneer deepening into an ugly snarl. "Shut your mouth, Martha. You're a squatter playing house with a criminal. You were a burden then, and you're a nuisance now. The mining conglomerate doubled their offer when they found out there's a coal seam running under this ridge. I'm not letting a rusted-out spinster and a disgraced sheriff steal my inheritance." The truth of it finally laid bare. It wasn't about the gold or the law. It was about the dark vein of coal buried deep beneath the pine roots. The land Silas had called dead was bleeding black wealth, and he had returned to carve it out, even if he had to carve through his own blood to get it. The words struck Martha, but they didn't wound her. Instead, they acted as a bellows to the fire Elias had helped her build. Every blister, every splinter, every agonizing pull of the heavy gut thread through the horse's flesh had cemented her ownership of this soil. She had bled for this ridge. Silas had only ever bled the people on it. Elias shifted his weight. The movement was slight, barely a fraction of an inch, but it carried the overwhelming, suppressive weight of an incoming avalanche. He raised the head of the heavy timber axe, letting it rest casually against his broad shoulder. "The deed was witnessed," Elias stated, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a physical vibration that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. "The gold was clean. If the assayer says different, He's a liar. And if you say different, you're a thief. You brought 3 men to evict a woman from her own hearth. That makes you a coward. The hired gun with the ruined nose spat a stream of dark tobacco juice into the mud. You talk too much for a dead man. Vance, we ain't here to argue the law. We're here to clear the property. The boy paid us to escort you off the ridge. If you don't walk, you'll be carried. The silence that followed was absolute. The dripping of the meltwater from the eaves seemed to stop entirely. The wind died in the pines. It was the heavy, suffocating pause before the lightning strikes. Elias's eyes finally shifted from Silas to the 3 armed men. The stoic, quiet giant of the cabin disappeared, replaced entirely by the legendary Mbarajo, violent sheriff the town of Oakhaven used to whisper about in the dark. The sheer, predatory stillness radiating from him made the horses whinny and step backward. "You're sitting on private land," Elias said softly, the jagged sentence carrying 1,000 promises of ruin. "You've made your threat. Now, you have exactly 10 seconds to turn those animals around and ride back to the valley. If you're still here when I finish counting, you don't leave this ridge, ever." Silas's face went pale. He had expected the giant to surrender to the law, to be cowed by the sheer numbers and the heavy rifles. He hadn't expected the mountain to threaten an eruption. "You're outnumbered, Vance," Silas stammered, his voice cracking, the polished city facade completely shattering. "Shoot him, put him in the dirt." Martha didn't wait. The time for silent endurance was over. The skills she had honed, the leverage, the timing, the brutal efficiency of survival clicked into place. She spun around, her boots hitting the warped floorboards, and kicked the heavy oak door open, rushing into the dark interior of the cabin. She knew exactly where Elias kept the Winchester. She wasn't running to hide. She was running to arm herself. The interior of the cabin was plunged into a heavy, expectant gloom. The only sound, the frantic, rhythmic thud of Martha's pulse drumming behind her ears. She moved with a desperate, terrifying clarity, her boots scraping across the worn floorboards. She didn't look back at the open doorway. She reached the hearth, her calloused fingers finding the cold, oiled steel of the Winchester rifle resting against the stone. The weapon was heavy, designed to stop a charging bear, its walnut stock bearing the scratches and dents of a violent frontier history. She gripped the lever, her knuckles turning bone white, and yanked it down. The metallic clack-clack of a heavy brass cartridge sliding into the chamber echoed in the small room, a mechanical, steel declaration of her own making. Before she could turn back to the door, a gunshot ripped through the damp spring air outside. It wasn't the heavy, booming report of the Winchester. It was the sharp, cracking whip of a Henry rifle. The sound was instantly followed by the chaotic, terrifying screams of panicked horses and the sickening thud of lead embedding itself into solid wood. Martha spun around, the heavy rifle braced against her hip, the smell of burning powder and wet earth flooding her senses. But as she rushed toward the porch, the world beneath her boots ceased to be solid. The single gunshot didn't just break the standoff, it broke the mountain. The sudden, concussive wave of sound from the rifle fired straight up toward the thawing ridge acted as the final strike against a landscape already pushed beyond its limits. The unseasonably fast melt had turned the high timberline into a saturated, unstable sponge of freezing water and loose shale. For a suspended, agonizing second, the air itself seemed to vibrate, pulling tight like a wire about to snap. Then came the sound. It wasn't a roar. It was a deep, guttural tear, as if the very fabric of the earth was being ripped in half by massive, invisible hands. Martha braced herself against the door frame as the cabin groaned violently. The vibration traveled up through her boots, shaking the marrow in her bones. She looked past the porch, past the standoff in the muddy yard, up toward the jagged spine of the ridge. The tree line was moving. A massive, terrifying wall of black mud, shattered spruce trunks, and razor-sharp shale was surging down the incline, swallowing the landscape with the speed and ferocity of a tidal wave. The sheer scale of the calamity reduced the armed men in the yard to insignificant specks. The air filled with the deafening, silent, percussive cracks of century-old pines snapping like dry kindling. The smell of exposed roots, crushed stone, and ancient, suffocating dirt blotted out the scent of the spring thaw. In the yard, the hired guns lost all pretense of aggression. The man who had fired the shot dropped his rifle, his face draining of all color as his horse reared violently, throwing him backward into the muck. The animal bolted, its hooves churning the mud in a desperate bid for the valley. The other two thugs spurred their mounts in blind terror, abandoning Silas without a second thought, galloping wildly toward the narrow trail leading down the mountain. Silas remained frozen. The polished city banker was paralyzed, his eyes wide and uncomprehending as the mountain descended upon him. His horse bucked, screaming in primal fear, and violently threw him to the ground. Silas landed hard in the alkaline mire. The breath knocked from his lungs, his tailored suit instantly ruined. He scrambled backward like a panicked crab, his hands clawing uselessly at the slick mud, screaming something that was completely drowned out by the roar of the earth. Elias did not run for the valley. The giant turned his massive shoulders, his dark eyes instantly calculating the trajectory of the collapsing ridge. The primary wave of the mudslide was barreling directly toward the rebuilt corral, where the heavy roan and the newly acquired draft horses were penned. He dropped the timber axe. He sprinted through the thigh-deep mud, his massive legs driving like iron pistons. He didn't care about the fleeing gunmen or the whimpering banker in the mud. He reached the heavy cedar gate of the corral just as the leading edge of the mudslide hit the back fence. The wood splintered with a sound like a cannon blast. Elias threw his entire weight against the iron latch, hauling the heavy gate open. "Yeah, get out," he roared, his voice a gravelly thunder that somehow cut through the deafening noise of the calamity. The terrified horses surged through the opening, a chaotic mass of muscle and panic, galloping to the relative safety of the high pasture. But Elias had stayed a second too long. A massive, uprooted spruce trunk, riding the crest of the black mud like a battering ram, crashed into the remaining section of the corral fence. The heavy cedar rails shattered into deadly, flying shrapnel. One of the massive logs, slick with freezing mud and jagged bark, swung wildly and caught Elias squarely across the chest. The impact was brutal, a sickening, heavy thud that knocked the giant off his feet and sent him flying backward into the mire. Before he could even attempt to rise, the secondary wave of the mudslide crashed over him. The uprooted spruce trunk rolled over the shattered fence and pinned Elias directly into the freezing muck. Then, as suddenly as the violence had begun, it ceased. The slide settled, burying the back half of the yard and the corral under 10 feet of black earth and shattered timber. The deafening roar faded into an eerie, ringing silence, broken only by the whimpering of Silas in the mud and the frantic, shallow gasps of breath coming from beneath the massive pine log. Martha stood on the porch, her chest heaving. The landscape she had spent months reclaiming had been violently rearranged. Half the yard was a graveyard of torn earth, but her eyes didn't linger on the ruined fence or the mud. They locked onto the massive, dark shape of the spruce trunk. Beneath it, pinned from the chest down, was Elias. The dark mud was rapidly filling the depression around him, threatening to swallow him whole. His eyes were open, fixed on the gray sky, his jaw locked tight against an agonizing pain he refused to voice. The scar on his face was stark against his ash-pale skin. Martha stepped off the porch, her boots sank deep into the freezing mud, but she didn't slow. She gripped the Winchester rifle tightly in her hands. The iron weight inside her hadn't returned, but a new, terrifying cold had settled in her veins. She walked past her brother. Silas was still on his knees in the mud, covered in filth, shivering uncontrollably and staring at the devastation with hollow, shell-shocked eyes. He looked up at her, expecting the worn, thin spinster he had abandoned in the town hall. Martha stopped. She didn't speak. She slowly raised the heavy barrel of the Winchester and pointed it directly at the center of Silas's ruined, mud-soaked chest. The metallic click of her thumb pulling the hammer back was the loudest sound left on the mountain. Silas froze, his breath hitching. The arrogance was completely gone, replaced by a raw, pathetic terror. "Get up," Martha commanded. The words weren't loud, but they carried the jagged, immovable weight of the rusted nails she had driven into the fence. She didn't stutter. Her voice was the steel of the claw hammer. "Get up and grab the chains from the shed. You're going to help me lift that timber, or I will leave you in this mud permanently." Silas stared at the dark bore of the rifle, then up at the cold, unyielding face of his sister. He scrambled to his feet, slipping in the muck, and ran toward the surviving tool shed. Martha lowered the rifle slightly, turning her gaze toward the pinned giant. The world had tried to bury him, just as it had tried to bury her, but she was no longer merely a survivor of the ridge. She gripped the weapon, the cold steel biting into her calloused palms. She was its guardian. The heavy iron logging chains dragged through the freezing muck, clanking with a dull, muffled rhythm as Silas stumbled back from the ruined shed. His breath came in ragged, panicked gasps, his polished leather boots sinking past the ankles with every step. The tailored wool suit, once a symbol of his arrogant supremacy, was now heavy with freezing, black mud, dragging him down like a sodden shroud. He dropped the chains at Martha's feet, his hands visibly shaking. Martha didn't look at him. She dropped to her knees in the freezing mire beside Elias. The giant lay completely still, his massive chest pinned beneath the crushing weight of the uprooted spruce. The black mud was rapidly acting like a vice, the freezing temperature turning the wet earth into a cement that threatened to suffocate him before the weight of the timber could shatter his ribs. His breathing was terrifyingly shallow, a harsh, rattling hiss through clenched teeth. Elias opened his eyes. They were dark, entirely devoid of the panic that consumed the banker whimpering a few feet away. He looked at Martha, the jagged, pale scar on his jaw standing out starkly against his mud-caked skin. "The slide." Elias grunted, the words barely more than a vibration in his throat. "Ground's still shifting. Get to the high pasture. Leave the dead wood." Martha's hands hovered over the massive trunk. She felt the rough, splintered bark, the sheer, immovable mass of the tree. A month ago, the town of Oakhaven would have expected her to obey the command, to weep over his body and flee into the pines to save herself. But the woman who had cowered in the town hall was dead, buried under the blistered skin of her palms and the calluses on her soul. "I didn't rebuild this ridge just to dig a grave on it," Martha said, her voice ringing out with a cold, steeled finality. She stood up, her eyes scanning the devastation. Pure muscle would not move the spruce, she knew that instinctively. But she also knew the language of the homestead now. She remembered the rusted nails in the corral fence, the way a heavy, unyielding object could be defeated by the simple, brutal geometry of leverage. She turned her gaze to Silas. He was backing away, staring at the mudslide as if it might surge forward again at any second. "Silas," Martha commanded, her voice slicing through his panic like a whip. "Go to the barn. In the rafters, there is a heavy iron block and tackle. Bring it, and grab the thickest surviving cedar rail you can carry. Do not come back empty-handed." Silas stared at her, his eyes wild. "We can't move that. We need to leave. Martha, the rest of the mountain is going to come down." Martha didn't argue. She raised the heavy barrel of the Winchester, the cold steel tracking him with a smooth, terrifying precision. She cocked the hammer again, the metallic click echoing sharply over the ruined yard. "You brought this storm to my door," she said, her voice completely stripped of any familial warmth, hollowed out and refilled with iron. "Now you are going to help me dig him out of it. Run." Silas broke. The last fragment of his city-bred arrogance shattered. He turned and scrambled toward the leaning barn, slipping and crawling through the muck like a beaten dog. Martha dropped the rifle onto a dry patch of porch board. She fell to her knees in the freezing mud beside Elias and plunged her bare hands directly into the earth beneath the massive log. The cold was an instant, biting agony, 1,000 rusted needles driving under her fingernails. She had to clear a channel under the spruce to slip the chain through. She dug with a feral intensity, ignoring the sharp edges of shattered shale that sliced into her palms. The smell of crushed pine needles, raw earth, and the metallic tang of her own bleeding fingers filled her nose. Elias watched her. He didn't speak again, conserving the little oxygen his compressed lungs could draw. The stoic silence between them was an anchor, a shared, unspoken understanding that the only way out was through the pain. Silas returned, dragging the heavy iron pulley system and a thick, 8-foot section of cedar fence rail. He collapsed onto his knees, his chest heaving, his immaculate hands covered in blisters and filth. Martha snatched the chains. She forced her bleeding hands back into the freezing mud, feeding the heavy iron links through the channel she had dug under the spruce trunk. She dragged the chain over the top, securing it with a heavy steel hook. She moved with a mesmerizing mechanical efficiency, completely ignoring the freezing wet wool clinging to her legs. She dragged the block and tackle to a surviving, deeply rooted pine tree 10 yards away, looping the anchor rope around its thick trunk. She ran the pulling line back to the chain secured around the spruce. It was the exact same principle she had used to pry the rotted corral rails loose, multiplied 100 times over, but she still needed a fulcrum to force the log upward, rather than just dragging it through the mud. She took the heavy cedar rail from Silas. She jammed one end deep into the compacted earth beneath the chain, angling it upward over a solid slab of exposed stone. "Take the rope," Martha ordered, pointing to the thick hemp line trailing from the iron pulley. Silas hesitated, looking at his soft, blistered hands, then at the massive weight of the tree. "It won't work, Martha. It's too heavy. I can't." Martha stepped forward. She didn't yell. She didn't reach for the rifle. She simply looked at him, her eyes dark, unyielding, and terrifyingly cold. "You sold my life for $10 because you thought my hands were useless," she said softly, the jagged sentence carrying a decade of silent fury. "Now you are going to use yours to earn your breath. Take the rope." Silas grabbed the coarse hemp. Martha stepped beside him, wrapping her own bleeding, calloused hands around the line just ahead of his. When I say pull, you put every ounce of your worthless soul into this line, she said. Pull. They threw their weight backward. The heavy rope snapped taut, shedding a layer of freezing water. The iron block and tackle shrieked, a high, agonizing squeal of metal grinding under immense pressure. The cedar rail groaned, bowing violently against the stone. The spruce trunk didn't move. Again! Martha roared, her voice tearing from her throat. Silas sobbed. A pathetic, broken sound, but he pulled. The coarse rope tore the skin from his palms instantly, leaving smears of bright red blood on the fibers. He tried to let go, the pain of actual labor completely foreign and unbearable to him. Martha slammed her shoulder into his, knocking him off balance but keeping him pinned to the rope. Do not let go! Pull! The muscles in her back, forged by months of swinging heavy hammers and chopping seasoned wood, corded tightly. The agonizing pain in her burst blisters faded into a white-hot hum of pure adrenaline. She leaned back, her boots digging deep trenches into the mud, fighting the suction of the earth. The iron pulley screamed again. The heavy chain bit deep into the bark of the spruce, crushing the wood fibers. And then the mountain surrendered. The massive spruce trunk groaned, the sound deep and resonant, and shifted upward. It lifted an inch, then 2. The sucking sound of the freezing mud relinquishing its grip echoed in the yard. Elias! Martha screamed, her arms trembling violently under the incredible strain, the cedar fulcrum bowing to the absolute limit of its breaking point. Elias didn't need to be told. The giant gritted his teeth, the muscles in his massive arms bunching into thick knots with a terrifying roar of pure, primal exertion. He used his hands to push against the freezing mud, dragging his crushed body backward, sliding out from beneath the devastating weight just as the cedar rail shattered. The rail exploded with a sharp crack, sending lethal splinters of wood flying into the air. The chain went slack. The massive spruce trunk crashed back down into the mud with a deafening, heavy thud, burying itself entirely in the trench Elias had just occupied. The sudden release of tension sent Martha and Silas tumbling backward into the muck. Silas curled into a tight ball in the mud. Clutching his bloody ruined hands to his chest, he wept openly, a high, reedy sound of total physical and mental collapse. The polished banker was gone. All that remained was a broken, terrified boy who had finally been forced to touch the hard-scrabble reality of the world he had tried to exploit. Martha did not look at him. She scrambled to her feet, her breathing ragged, her apron soaked in freezing water and black earth. She rushed to Elias. The giant was sitting up, his massive chest heaving as he dragged the cold mountain air into his bruised lungs. He was covered in black mud, his duster ruined, his breathing ragged, but he was alive. He looked up at Martha, the dark eyes wide, catching the stark, undeniable truth of what had just happened. She didn't wait for him to find his feet. Martha reached down, grabbing the thick canvas of his coat. Elias reached up, his massive, scarred hand wrapping around her forearm. She braced her boots in the mud, her spine locking into a rusted steel rod, and pulled. Elias rose. He was a mountain of a man, his weight staggering, but he didn't fall. He leaned heavily against her. Martha didn't buckle. She stood perfectly upright, bearing the crushing weight of the giant against her side. She wrapped her arm around his waist, anchoring him to the earth. She looked out over the ruined yard, past the shattered corral, past the whimpering, broken form of her brother in the mud. The storm had tried to scour her from the earth, just as the town had tried to erase her, but the alkali dust and the winter freeze had failed. She was no longer a mistake, a spinster, or a debt to be settled. She held the giant upright, her chin lifted high, her eyes cold and commanding as she surveyed her domain. She was the absolute, undisputed guardian of the ridge, and she had forged her crown in iron and pine. The descent from the shattered ridge took 3 agonizing hours. Every step a brutal negotiation with the thawing, treacherous earth. The mountain had tried to swallow them, but it had only succeeded in scouring away the last remaining fragments of fear. They rode the surviving draft horses, the massive animals picking their way carefully through the debris and the freezing mud. The sun broke through the heavy, bruised clouds just as they reached the timberline, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on the procession. Elias rode beside her. He sat tall in the saddle, an immovable monument of grit, though every rhythmic sway of the horse clearly sent a wave of blinding agony through his crushed ribs. The makeshift bandage wrapped tightly beneath his ruined, mud-caked duster was already blooming with a dark, rusted stain. Yet his jaw remained locked, the pale scar standing out sharply against his weathered skin. He didn't complain. He didn't ask to stop. He simply rode, his dark eyes fixed on the valley below, his massive presence a silent, terrifying shield at Martha's flank. Trailing behind them, tethered by a coarse hemp rope to the horn of Martha's saddle, was Silas. The polished city banker was gone, entirely erased by the brutality of the mountain. His tailored wool suit was a heavy, foul-smelling rag of black mud and torn fabric. His hands, bound in front of him, were wrapped in bloody rags, the skin stripped raw by the logging chain he had been forced to pull. He slumped forward, his chin resting on his chest, weeping silently. The arrogant sneer had been replaced by a hollow, vacant stare. He wasn't riding as a conqueror. He was being dragged as a spoil of war. Oakhaven appeared exactly as they had left it. A pristine, oblivious cluster of whitewashed buildings and false front stores huddled safely away from the violence of the frontier. The morning air was crisp, smelling of wood smoke, fresh baking bread, and the comfortable, ignorant complacency of people who had never been forced to fight the earth for their breath. Martha's horse stepped onto the main thoroughfare. The heavy, iron-rimmed hooves struck the packed dirt street with a sharp, rhythmic clack, clack, clack that immediately cut through the gentle hum of the morning market. At the livery, the blacksmith, Miller, froze mid-swing, his heavy hammer suspended over the anvil. Outside the general store, 3 women in immaculate, starched dresses stopped their idle gossip, the smiles dying instantly on their faces. A cart driver reined his team to a halt, his mouth falling open. The entire town seemed to hold its collective breath, paralyzed by the sheer, imposing spectacle rolling down their pristine street. They looked like ghosts conjured from the darkest myths of the high ridge. Martha sat perfectly straight in the saddle, her heavy wool coat coated in dried, gray alkali dust and the dark, metallic stains of dried blood. Her hair, once pinned back in the neat, submissive bun of a spinster, hung loose and wild around her shoulders, tangled with pine needles and earth. She held the thick leather reins in her left hand. Her right hand rested casually on the walnut stock of the Winchester rifle laying across her lap. Her knuckles were split, calloused, and bruised, entirely devoid of the softness the valley demanded of its women. She did not lower her eyes. She stared directly ahead, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the people who had abandoned her. She met Miller's soot-stained face. She met the eyes of the women who had whispered about the asylum. Her stare was not vengeful. It was something far more terrifying. It was absolute, unyielding indifference. The iron weight that had once suffocated her was gone, replaced by the immovable gravity of a woman who had mastered the mountain. The procession stopped in the dead center of the town square, directly in front of the sheriff's office and the federal assayer's building. The silence in the street was absolute. A heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed against the whitewashed storefronts. The only sounds were the heavy, labored breathing of the draft horses and the pathetic, wet sniffling coming from the broken man tethered to Martha's saddle. The wooden door of the sheriff's office opened. A young man wearing a tin star, a man who had taken the job only after Elias had surrendered it years ago, stepped out onto the boardwalk. He took one look at Elias's massive, battered frame and the dark, unreadable violence radiating from the former lawman, and his hand instinctively moved away from the Colt resting on his hip. He swallowed hard, his throat clicking in the quiet morning. "Vance?" The young sheriff nodded respectfully, his voice tight. Then his eyes shifted to the bound man covered in filth. "Martha, what in God's name happened up on that ridge? Is that Silas?" Martha swung her leg over the saddle, dropping to the dirt street. Her boots hit the ground with a solid, indisputable thud. She didn't stumble. She walked slowly toward the boardwalk, the heavy Winchester resting against her shoulder, the barrel pointed safely at the sky, though the threat it carried was universally understood. She reached into the deep pocket of her ruined coat and pulled out the folded, mud-stained parchment Silas had brandished before the mudslide. She tossed it onto the boardwalk. It landed at the young sheriff's boots. "That is a forged writ of seizure," Martha stated. Her voice did not shake. It did not carry the high, thin stutter of the woman they had auctioned off months ago. It was gravel and iron, carrying the exact same low, resonant thunder as the giant who sat silently behind her. "Silas forged a federal document. He brought 3 armed men to my property to execute it. He intended to drive us off the ridge and claim the coal seam running beneath the timberline." The whispers erupted immediately, crawling through the gathered crowd like a sudden fire in a dry brush. "Coal!" The word hung in the air, transforming their pity into a sudden, greedy shock. They looked at the mud-caked woman, suddenly realizing the dead land they had laughed at was a fortune they had practically given away. Silas raised his head, his face a mask of desperate, tear-streaked filth. She tried to kill me," he croaked, his voice cracking, a pathetic whine that barely carried past the horses. "Vance attacked my men. They stole my inheritance." Elias shifted in his saddle. The movement was slow, agonizing, but it carried the suppressive weight of an avalanche. He rested his massive, scarred hands on the saddle horn, fixing his dark, dead-eyed stare entirely on Silas. The banker instantly shrank back, pulling against the ropes, a terrified animal recognizing the apex predator. Elias didn't need to speak a single word. His silence was a devastating cross-examination that destroyed Silas's lie before it could take root. Martha turned her back on her brother, dismissing him entirely. She faced the gathered town square, the blacksmith, the baker, the churchgoers who had sat in the pews and watched her be sold for $10. "You auctioned me," Martha said, the words ringing out clear and sharp, slicing through the murmurs of the crowd. "Right there, in the hall. You looked at a decade of my labor, a decade of my youth spent washing your fevers and burying my own dead, and you priced it at $10. A heavy, suffocating shame rippled through the front row of the crowd. Miller the blacksmith looked down at his boots. The gossiping women pulled their shawls tight, refusing to meet her eye. "You called me a worn-thin fixture," Martha continued, pacing slowly, her boots grinding the alkali dust. You thought my worth was tied to my age, to my softness, to whether or not a man in a clean suit spoke for me. You looked at Elias Vance, a man who gave his blood to keep this town from burning a decade ago, and you called him a violent ghost. You hide behind your clean white fences and your Sunday sermons, believing that the dirt on your hands is a sign of failure. She stopped, raising her calloused, blistered, and blood-stained hands for the entire square to see. The fresh, dark stitches on her thumb, the burns from the cast-iron stove, the deep, raw gouges from the logging chains. "This is not failure," she declared, her voice echoing off the brick facade of the assayer's office. "This is the price of survival. The mountain does not care about your gossip. It does not care about your forged papers. It cares about iron and pine and the willingness to stand in the freezing dark when the earth tries to bury you. Silas brought guns to the ridge to take what he deemed dead. The mountain buried his men. I made him dig." She pointed the heavy barrel of the rifle toward the sobbing man tied to her horse. "Take him," she told the sheriff. "He hired guns to commit murder. He forged federal documents. If you don't lock him in a cell, I will drag him back up to the timberline and let the wolves hold court." The young sheriff nodded quickly, stepping off the boardwalk. He pulled a heavy iron knife from his belt and cut the tether securing Silas to the saddle, immediately hauling the broken banker to his feet by the collar of his ruined suit. Silas didn't fight. He practically collapsed into the sheriff's grip, desperate for the safety of a rusted iron cage, desperate to be away from the terrifying woman who had broken him. Martha watched them drag her brother into the dark interior of the jailhouse. The heavy iron door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a final, definitive period at the end of a long, bitter sentence. The town square remained perfectly still. No one moved to congratulate her. No one offered a hollow apology. They simply stood, paralyzed by the overwhelming realization that the woman they had discarded was no longer of their world. She had transcended their petty, shallow currency. Martha turned back to Elias. The giant was watching her. The pale scar on his jaw softened by a look of profound, quiet reverence. He didn't offer a grand speech. He simply gave a slow, measured nod of his massive head, acknowledging the absolute mastery she had just displayed. She secured the Winchester into the leather scabbard of her saddle. She grabbed the reins, setting her boot into the stirrup, and swung herself up with a fluid, practiced strength. She didn't look back at the town. She didn't care to see the shame or the awe on their faces. The valley was nothing more than a memory of a ghost she used to be. Martha clicked her tongue, turning the heavy draft horse around. "Let's go home. Elias, we have a fence to rebuild." They rode out of Oakhaven side by side, leaving the town choking on its own silence, their shadows stretching long and unbroken toward the high, unyielding timberline of the ridge. 8 winters had carved their unforgiving signatures into the granite face of the high ridge since the day the mountain had tried to bury them. The landscape, once a rotting monument to a dead man's exhausted dreams, had been violently and beautifully resurrected. The original, sagging cabin had been absorbed into a sprawling, formidable ranch house built of massive, hand-hewn spruce logs and reinforced with heavy iron braces forged by the town blacksmith, a man who now tipped his hat with profound, nervous respect whenever the Vances rode their heavy draft horses into the valley. The cedar roof shakes were thick, meticulously layered, and freshly oiled, holding back the heavy mountain snows with an unyielding, silent arrogance. The air around the homestead no longer tasted of alkali dust and decay. It was rich with the scent of rendering tallow, curing meats in the heavy stone smokehouse and the sharp, clean bite of mountain pine. Below the timberline, where Silas had once sought to rip the earth apart for a quick fortune, a massive, methodical operation pulsed with life. Martha had never sold the land to the mining conglomerate. Instead, she had leased the subterranean rights on a brutal, unforgiving contract that dictated every ounce of coal extracted paid a heavy toll directly to the surface. The black wealth bleeding from the earth had funded the purchase of 50 head of prime Hereford cattle, their dark red coats and stark white faces dotting the high, treacherous pastures like scattered embers against the early morning frost. The rotted corral that had nearly cost Elias his life had been replaced by acres of meticulous, unbreakable fencing. Ironwood posts sunk deep into the bedrock, connected by thick, milled rails that did not bow, splinter, or scream under the weight of the massive beasts pressing against them. Martha stood on the sweeping wraparound porch of the main house. She was 46 years old. The passing time had not softened her. It had tempered her in the forge. The thin, hollowed-out spinster who had cowered in the shadows of the Oakhaven town hall was entirely unrecognizable. She wore a heavy, tailored riding skirt of dark gray wool and a thick canvas jacket lined with sheepskin. Her hair was heavily streaked with silver, braided tightly down her back, a crown of frost that demanded absolute respect. She held a heavy ceramic mug of dark coffee, the steam rising to warm a face that was weathered, lined, and unspeakably beautiful in its fierce, grounded capability. She looked down at her hands resting against the warm ceramic. The deep, jagged scars on her palms from the logging chains had faded into thick, pale lines, permanent maps of the excruciating price she had paid for her kingdom. The iron weight that used to suffocate her ribs was a distant, almost foreign memory. In its place was a profound, unshakable gravity. She didn't merely exist on the ridge anymore, she was its very foundation. As she took a slow sip of the bitter chicory blend, the memory of her brother's voice auctioning her for $10 surfaced, but it carried absolutely no sting. It felt like a story told about a pathetic stranger in another lifetime. She realized, watching the sun break over the distant peaks, that prosperity was not measured by the gold sitting in the county bank vault, though they commanded plenty of it now. True prosperity was the total, absolute absence of fear. It was the grounded knowledge that if the mountain decided to throw another devastating storm at their door, she had the calloused hands, the leverage, and the steeled will to break it. The silence of the ridge was no longer a suffocating void waiting to be filled by the cruelty of others. It was a vast, open canvas she had painted with her own survival. The heavy oak door behind her opened, the massive brass hinges gliding silently. Elias stepped out onto the porch. The giant was 50 now. The thick hair at his temples had turned entirely white, matching the pale, jagged scar that still pulled taut along his jawline. He moved with a slight, rhythmic limp, a permanent, physical souvenir from the uprooted spruce that had crushed his chest 8 years ago. But it did not diminish his terrifying, monumental presence. It simply grounded him, making him look less like a frontier myth and more like a mountain that had successfully survived a cataclysm. He was carrying a small, intricately carved wooden horse, the fresh pine shavings still clinging to his heavy, oil-stained canvas trousers. He walked to the edge of the porch, resting his massive forearms on the thick top rail, and looked out over the sprawling valley. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The stoic lexicon they shared required no wasted breath to acknowledge the empire they had dragged out of the mud. From the massive double doors of the new barn, a sound completely foreign to the old, dead homestead rang out, It was the sharp, clear laughter of a child. A boy, no older than 7, sprinted into the muddy yard, his small boots kicking up clods of thawing earth. He was a perfect, striking synthesis of the two people who had forged him. He had Elias's broad, solid shoulders and dark, unreadable eyes, but he possessed Martha's sharp, analytical intensity in his brow. He was chasing a half-wild cattle dog, a thick length of braided leather rope swinging wildly in his small, dirt-smudged hands. "Keep your elbow down, Caleb." Elias's voice rumbled across the yard, a low, tectonic vibration that carried easily over the morning wind. "You throw the loop with your wrist, not your shoulder. You're trying to catch the dog, not beat the wind to death." The boy skidded to a halt, his boots digging deep into the muck. He didn't pout or whine at the correction. He possessed the same stoic, hard-scrabble focus as his father. He adjusted his stance, planting his feet firmly in the dirt, dropping his small elbow and whipping the leather lariat forward with a sharp, calculated flick of his wrist. The loop sailed through the crisp air, opening perfectly, and landed squarely over a wooden fence post 10 yards away, snapping tight with a satisfying crack. Elias gave a single, slow nod of his massive head. The boy beamed, a flash of pure, unadulterated joy that briefly pierced the heavy, somber stoicism of the frontier before he sprinted off to retrieve his rope, his laughter swallowed by the vastness of the timberline. Martha watched the boy, the steeled iron in her spine softening just a fraction of an inch. She leaned against Elias's massive shoulder, feeling the solid rhythmic beat of his heart through the thick canvas of his coat. He reached over, his massive, scarred hand wrapping entirely over hers as it rested on the porch rail. The touch was as grounding as a ship's anchor hitting solid rock in a tempest. The foreman from the coal seam came up the trail before dawn. Elias said quietly, his gaze tracking the boy as he wrestled with the dog in the mud. "They hit a solid wall of granite on the lower eastern shaft. Wants to know if we authorize the use of heavy blasting powder to punch through." Martha took another sip of her coffee, the bitter liquid sharpening her thoughts. She calculated the risk instantly, her mind mapping the logistics of the blast, the potential instability to the ridge's foundation, the monetary cost against the expected yield. She wasn't merely a mother or a wife tending a hearth. She was the chief architect and absolute ruler of their survival. "No," Martha replied, her voice firm, carrying that familiar, unyielding steel that had cowed her brother years ago. "The vein runs north, away from the granite bedrock. Tell him to redirect the diggers. We don't blow the foundation of the ridge just because the digging gets hard. We go around it. We endure it." Elias's pale scar twitched as a rare ghost of a smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. He liked it when she commanded the mountain. It reminded him of the woman who had pointed a heavy Winchester at her own blood to save his life in the freezing mud. "I reckon the foreman won't much like the delay," Elias noted, his heavy thumb slowly tracing the thick, faded scar on the back of her hand, a silent homage to her mastery. "The valley is full of impatient men who don't like to wait for their money," Martha said, turning her head to look directly into the dark, bottomless pools of his eyes. "But the mountain doesn't rush for anyone, and neither do we." The sun finally crested the eastern peaks, flooding the entire homestead with a brilliant, blinding gold. It illuminated the sprawling cattle pens, the heavy stone smokehouse, and the massive barn, painting the empire of iron and pine in the colors of absolute victory. It caught the silver in Martha's hair and the white at Elias's temples. They stood together on the porch of the house they had built with blistered hands and raw will, watching their son learn the brutal, beautiful mechanics of the world. The humiliation of the town hall, the suffocating auction, the crushing mudslide, they were not tragedies. They were the intense, searing heat of the forge, the necessary fire that had burned away the dead wood and left only the pure, unbreakable iron. They had not just settled a debt, they had conquered the ledger. The concept of human worth is a fragile, peculiar thing when left entirely in the hands of the valley. Down in the absolute safety of the whitewashed towns and the quiet, orderly pews, worth is a ledger kept in ink and whispered gossip. It is measured by the unblemished smoothness of a woman's hands, the fading youth in her cheeks, the submissive obedience in her silence, and the weight of the silver in her dowry. In the valley, a soul is merely a commodity to be continuously appraised, traded, and ultimately discarded when the rust of age or tragic circumstance begins to show through the paint. They look at a decade spent tending to the dying and see only a foolish exhaustion. They look at a woman stripped of her pride in a public hall and see only a $10 charity case. They believe, with the absolute blinding arrogance of the comfortable, that a person's value is permanently fixed by the lowest bid the crowd is willing to offer. But the high ridge operates under a vastly different, unforgiving theology. The mountain does not care for ink ledgers, and it is entirely deaf to the cruel, idle chatter of congregations. The mountain only understands the brutal, undeniable truth of the forge. Up here, where the winter wind tastes of pulverized ice and the soil is a reluctant, freezing participant in the act of survival, worth is not granted by a polite society. It is excavated. It is pulled violently from the frozen mud with blistered, bleeding hands. It is hammered into existence against the unyielding anvil of profound isolation, struck repeatedly by the heavy, iron mallet of hardship and weather. Every burst blister on a palm, every splinter of cedar lodged deep in the flesh, every drop of blood spilled to mend a rotted fence or sew together the torn hide of a panicked horse, these are the true, unassailable currencies of consequence. The deep scars that the town of Oakhaven viewed as grotesque markers of a ruined life are, in the hard scrabble logic of the frontier, the very receipts of survival. They are indisputable proof that when the earth attempted to swallow a soul whole, that soul possessed the terrifying grit to plant its boots in the muck and push back. Elias Vance understood this long before he dropped his gold onto the auction crate. He knew that the heavy, suffocating silence he carried was not an empty void, but a sanctuary built to keep the fragile illusions of the valley out. He recognized that the woman standing in the shadows of that hall was not a broken vessel, but a piece of raw, untempered iron waiting for the heat. Martha Vance did not find her ultimate worth in the $600 Elias paid. That gold merely bought the dirt. She found her worth in the heavy, steel head of a claw hammer. She found it in the agonizing, rhythmic pull of an iron logging chain when the mountain tried to bury them both. She found it in the stark, profound realization that the silence of the wilderness was not an enemy designed to isolate her, but a vast, empty foundation, waiting patiently for her to build her own thunder. We are all, at some point in our fleeting, fragile lives, dragged into the town hall of our own making. We are all forced to stand in the cold, unforgiving draft while the world around us calculates our failures, highlights our rusted edges, and assigns us a price that barely covers the cost of our breathing. The humiliation presses against the ribs like a cold iron weight. The instinct is to bow the head, to accept the crushing verdict of the crowd, to shrink into the shadows and allow the auction to conclude without a single fight. The instinct is to let the silence of the room define the rest of our days. But the frontier teaches us a vastly different, violent truth. It teaches us that the ledger is never truly closed until the hammer strikes the final nail. It teaches us that the greatest, most enduring acts of heroism do not occur on battlefields with bugles and charging horses. They occur in the terrifying, freezing quiet of a ruined homestead, when a person decides to pick up a rusted tool instead of a white flag. Heroism is the quiet, jagged decision to stop apologizing for the space you take up and to start defending the ground you stand on. The Vances did not just survive the ridge, they mastered it. They took the dead, discarded things of the world, a ruined cabin, a hollowed-out spinster, a disgraced lawman, an abandoned piece of earth, and they bound them together with sweat, iron, and an unbreakable stoic grace. They proved that a life is not defined by the worst things that happen to it, but by the relentless, unyielding labor applied to the aftermath. The valley will always have its whispers, and the mountain will always have its violent storms. The mud will freeze, the timber will snap, and the world will perpetually attempt to reduce you to the sum of your deepest, ugliest wounds. The auction block is always waiting in the dark. So, as the wind howls through the skeletal pines and the cold alkali dust settles over the ledger of your own life, a single, definitive question remains standing in the cold. When the world stripped you of your value and the crowd waited eagerly for you to accept your defeat, would you have stayed in the silence?